Well, today I'm delighted to welcome Mark van Weegen. Mark, it's great to see you again. Mark was a senior partner and a board member of Kearney for many years and an extraordinary rainmaker, and now runs his own firm, coaching and advising senior executives and also providing governance and leadership and skill development to professional service firms. So Mark, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Mike. Great to be here.
So let's kick off, Mark, around client development and business development. This is something I know you have 30 years plus of experience around. What would you say were some of the main lessons and principles that you can draw from your time?
Yeah. Well, Mike, that's a question around how do you solve world hunger almost. Maybe a couple of initial thoughts, and then we can dive deeper as you see fit. One of them is that if you choose to be in professional services, you have a sort of self-image about you, and which means high-end. I'm a problem solver. I work with senior executives and so on. So words like business development or sales or revenue generation are typically words that, at least in my personal life, I always resisted because I felt they were more or less beneath me. Those words are good if you sell peanut butter, I always thought, but not if you sell high-end professional services to senior executives. Later on, I found that actually was the wrong image to use, and those words actually create that image because it suggests that you're proposing things to the client with an end goal, and the end goal then is sales, is revenue. And later I came to believe that the more you focus on that part of it, the outcome, the less successful you actually are. And it's a little bit like Roger Federer. When you ask Roger Federer at the beginning of a tournament, are you going to win it? He says, yes, I'm going to win it. He goes in with the expectation and the aspiration to win the tournament. But while he is playing, he's not focused on winning the tournament. He's focused on playing the best point he can. And it's always interesting, I think, when you hear interviews after a match from the best tennis players or the best football players or the best athletes. And I'm sure from your music background, you have the same thing. What they remember is incredible detail about what they could have done better. And yes, they will be happy that they won, and they will say so. But at the same time, they continuously focused on the process. And I think the same thing is true when you do business development, client development in professional services. The more you focus on the outcome, in fact, the less effective you're going to be. What you have to do is focus on playing the best point, having the best conversation possible with the client. And that is not from your vantage point, it is from the vantage point of the client. In other words, the client ought to say after that conversation, this was the best conversation I've ever had with somebody like you. If you achieve that, then ultimately the outcome will be that you win the tournament, that you get an engagement or a project with that client. But it is because you've strung together a number of conversations, a number of interactions, and some of them written, some of them by video, some of them in person, that together adds up to a winning Wimbledon, if you will. So that's sort of one thought, and that requires a different mindset. And all of a sudden, once you embrace that mindset, you realize that you're not selling. You're in fact helping the client. You're helping the client refine her thinking. You're helping the client create more insight. You're helping the client navigate the context and the stakeholder dynamics in which the client operates. So in other words, you're not selling, you're helping. And by helping, you ultimately are selling.
So that's sort of that just for a second, Mark, because that's interesting. How do you avoid then, because you talked about it, consultants are problem solvers. There's a certain amount, because of the high standards that go into this kind of profession, there's a certain amount of insecurity. People are often thinking about, how am I doing? Your point about Federer or whoever it is, they are correcting and critiquing themselves along the way. So often the attention lands back on yourself. How am I doing? How did you manage to shift the attention off yourself in those key moments, should we say, in the conversation?
Yeah.
And stay with them rather than worrying about yourself?
Yeah, great question, Mike. And that's exactly the crux. So just it becomes a lot easier if you're successful, because if you're successful, then the importance of the next interaction with a particular person is actually relatively less, because there's less at stake for you personally. And I always found that if every professional services partner will go through cycles, and part of that is luck or lack of luck. Part of that is your own commitment and engagement at that very point in time. I remember after my second daughter was born, I sort of lost interest a little bit. Not that I knew that of myself, but I could tell later from the results. And so you go through these cycles, and keeping the focus on the client is actually the easiest if you're doing well, if you're in the upswing of that cycle, because again, the stakes of succeeding in that particular interaction, in that particular opportunity, is less. So so the trap arises when you're in the downswing, which happens for all of us. And you were very generous in introducing me as a rainmaker. And I was fortunate enough that I had many years that I was actually quite successful in working with my clients. But that said, this cycle occurred with me also. And the only thing I could say to managing your mental state is to sort of realize that if you flip a coin 10 times in a row, there are certain sequences when you hit heads 10 times in a row, i.e. you might have success 10 times in a row. And the point there is to not believe your own to not sort of get any hubris around that. But the flip side is also true, that when you flip that coin, there are 10 times in a row sometimes that where you miss. And you know, if you think about this, I think the probability, I never did the math, but if you do the probability of 10 times tails in a row, then there's probably 3% opportunity or chance that happens. So it's actually quite a decent chance. So the trick is to manage your mental state, and
keep playing for it. I mean, it's also interesting, Mark. Sorry to interrupt you, but you know, we know that those who win engagements and those who lose engagements have the same goal in mind, but it's the habits and the processes. You mentioned processes before that kind of make the difference. Can you share a little bit about your habits and processes?
Yeah. Well, I'll do that, but let me challenge your premise a little bit, because the goal is not the same. I think if I reflect back on my success, I was most successful with clients I generally liked personally. I generally was more successful with companies I liked. I generally was more successful in sectors that I liked. So the goal in my case, if I'm really honest with myself, was not necessarily to get big sales. The big sales were a result. My goal was to help these people that I liked, in companies that I liked, in sectors that I liked, to be successful. And as a result, because that was the mindset, the result was there. And again, back to that earlier point, the more you focus on that outcome, I think the less successful you're going to be. So focus on the process. So what then are the habits, to your question? The habits are to stay connected with those individuals and with those companies and through those cycles, because there will be times where you're going to be very busy doing paid work for a particular client, be it a person or an institution, a company, an organization. And there's going to be other times where you're not all that busy with paid work. And the trick is there to, again, stay focused on their success, be patient, be persistent, and be proud. And know that the fact that you're in a trough with them, or even across your entire portfolio of clients, is temporary. And so reflect on the stroke, to stay with the Federer example, reflect on what you did better, what you could have done better, but don't lose the faith and don't lose the fact. And with that, accept that you will miss a number of times. You know, and Serena Williams, the most successful tennis player, man or female, in the history of the world, I think she wins maybe 1/3 of the Grand Slam tournaments as she enters. So in other words, in a grand goal of winning a Grand Slam, she fails 2 out of 3 times. You know, the best baseball players, and they make $25-30 million a year, they strike out 2 out of 3 times, and they fail 2 out of 3 times. In golf, right, and on and on and on. So get not in the habit of losing, but get in the habit of accepting that if you put something forward to a client, that maybe 2 out of 3 times the client says that's interesting, but not now, or you know, that's not that interesting, and you've misinterpreted my situation or my aspirations. You learn from it, but then keep going, because you realize that that's just par for the course.
Tell us a little bit, Mark, about you have often offered up bold points of view. You know, some might say that you come across as pretty fearless with your executive clients. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're thinking from, and what is it that shapes your points of view?
Yeah, and if you look at it, it might look fearless in the context of this perspective of I'm taking a risk, and through that risk, I am, in fact, taking a risk that I upset my client or I upset the relationship I have with my client. But that's all driven by the intention you assume underneath it, right? If you assume, and if the client suspects your intention is to sell a big piece of work, then of course you're taking a big risk. If, however, your intention is that you're going to be helpful to that client, and your judgment at that point in time is that the client needs shaking up, and the client, when I say client, I mean the individual or the institution, if the client needs shaking up, then, and you generally believe that that's the case, given their situation, given your understanding of their challenges and their aspirations and their opportunities and so on, then all of a sudden it's not fearless, it is being helpful. Therefore, you need to check your own intention. Why am I putting this forward at this point in time? Is that to serve myself with this big expectation of a big piece of work as a result? Or am I doing this for the benefit of my client? And the client will see that way, you know. And it's not unlike in our personal situations, right? Sometimes we need a friend who shakes us up a little bit and kicks us in the rear and says, "Okay, Mike, you know, you better straighten out, or you better dial up your energy," or so on. And the same thing is true with your clients. So that it starts and ends with your intention. Is your intention to help the client, or is your intention to sell something big? And yes. You know, I think that just to put a bow around that point, you know, if you go into a car dealership and you feel that the client, that the salesperson is trying to sell you a car, your initial reaction, well, you almost sense that immediately. Your immediate reaction for most all of us is to push back. Whereas if you deal with a salesperson who's trying to understand what it is you need and is trying to understand and how what he has to offer might solve that, you get a very different reaction. So again, if you're not sure about your own intention and whether what I say is true or not, just check your own sort of gut reaction when you get confronted with somebody who's trying to sell you something.
I remember you shared a story once, Mark, about one executive who wasn't being clear about their strategy. I've got two questions here. One, could you share a little bit about that story? Because I think it illustrates kind of where you're thinking from. But secondly, I've heard from a lot of consultants that they struggle to move from a point of view that they might share to actually the proposition. How do you do that so it doesn't come across as pitchy?
Yeah. Well, to me, there is two parts to this, right? There's this mindset piece, and we've spoken a lot about that so far. And I'll say one more thing about that in response to your question. And there's a skills piece to it. And I'll talk about that in a second. So the example you're alluding to was a client where I'd done quite a bit of work. And he had just been named the CEO. And about 6 months in, we had a conversation as we had on a regular basis. And I remember this. He had a nice office, and he had the big sliding doors, and you could sit outside. And we sat on his patio. And we had a nice sandwich in front of us. And he was complaining about his leadership team and that they weren't really executing. And at one point in time, I grabbed a napkin and I said, Ken, and I drew squirrely lines all over the place. And he said, what is that? I said, well, Ken, that's actually you. And Ken was an incredibly curious, intellectually curious guy. He was very engaged, full of ideas, just a great guy, very, very engaging. But because he was so intellectually curious and he had so many ideas and he was so creative, he was going all over the place with the sort of ideas he put forward and conveyed to his team. And his team sort of got confused. And much later, I came to his office, and he had framed this little napkin with all the square lines, and he had hung it on the wall right opposite of his desk. And he said, I use this to remind myself of that conversation. And I think that's one of the things to remember is that the impact you have as a professional services partner oftentimes sits in those conversations, and those cement the relationship and lead them to large engagements. Did he get an immediate return on that conversation, i.e. did he sign an engagement letter? No, he did not, but it very much cemented at the depth of the relationship I had with Ken. So the mindset thing, I did that because I generally like Ken, and I generally felt that that's what he needed to hear. So it's not fearless in that regard. Then to the second part of your question, right, there is a skills piece to it also. And, I'm a firm believer in asking the right questions. There is the methodology around, for example, SPIN, which I think is great. There are other ones in terms of framing and, in behavioral economics and so forth. There's a lot of activity now around how you frame up things, how you present options to your clients, and that sort of thing that I think are incredibly important for partners in professional services to know. And with that, I generally see a great deficiency in that in professional services. So they might get training up till the moment that they are partner or one level below partner, but then all of a sudden, in many places, they get sort of thrown into situations, and we expect that the apprenticeship model has generated enough of the skills and the awareness that is required. And I generally really think that that's wrong. Partners, even if they've been a partner 5 or 10 years, require a continuous sort of refining of their skills beyond sort of the practice that they have in real time. And you know this from your music experience, and in sports, it's the same thing. The ratio between practice and application, the performance is 9-1, or sometimes even more. And I think the same thing ought to be true professional services. That there is very intentional practice to get better outside of the performance and debrief on the performance.
Do you have any advice, Mark, for how you go about framing that with the client? So do you find that the client would ask you, okay, what do you think we should do next? And so that's the prompt. Or do you offer a series of options, doing nothing? There may be a match with the kind of capabilities we have, or how do you find that flows from landing a point?
Yeah. Well, it probably goes beyond the depth of this conversation, because it's actually quite difficult at times, right? So it requires decent skills. Generally, I believe, similar as it is with when you're trying to raise children, that if you can get your child to certain insight, rather than them telling them, you cannot do that, or watch out because you're going to burn your hand or so. That if you get your child to that insight themselves through the interaction you have with him or her, is generally more effective. And I think I don't want to compare my clients to my children, but generally the same thing is true. If you can get the clients to say to you, I think we ought to do this, and I think you can help me with that. And that's a lot more effective than me saying to the client, I think you ought to do that, and I think I can help you with that. So back to this point that we had at the beginning of the conversation around sort of where's the balance in the conversation, what's your intention, and certainly also what is your status. And it's incredibly important that you maintain your status. Yes, your professional services you serve, right? But that doesn't mean that you have an unequal status with your clients. So the conversation you have, and therefore the way you frame up those things are reflective of the status. And then lastly, it depends on the situation. And I think there's an analog there with the medical field, right? Sometimes if you look at the person, the pharmacist tells you something. They say, Mike, this drug, you take that with food every morning. And if you forget it one day, you just skip one day. And then you're really playing the expert role. The brain surgeon doesn't tell you much, does things, but it is also sort of a unilateral relationship. Whereas if you have a nurse or a psychotherapist, right, the relationship is yet again very different. And the way you add value is oftentimes through asking questions and creating insight rather than prescribing or doing. So the way you frame up things partially depends on sort of the situation where you fit. So our prior example of Ken, at that point in time, I was actually not very prescriptive in many ways, but it was quite direct in the messaging. And what helped in that regard was that I used the metaphor, right? In this case, this squirrely drawing, as a way to communicate it, which is part of the skills question you had.
Very last question, Mark, which is about non-verbal communication. I know that you have been with your team on an elevator and you kind of sometimes, grab them and kind of, you charge them up. Can you say just a few words about the importance of non-verbal communication and energy, as well as what we've covered so far?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if you get a big opportunity with a client, that should not be a reason for stress or nerves. It should be a reason for celebration. And I've used sports a couple of times in analog. If you get to take the final penalty kick in a shootout in the final of the World Cup, it's a tremendous opportunity. It's a tremendous opportunity. It shouldn't be a big threat. This is what you've worked for a long time in order to get yourself to that point. So enjoy it. And clients should be able to feel that you're enjoying it, that you are intrigued by their situation, that you are interested in their success, that you are enjoying what you're doing, and that sort of thing. So it's incredibly important, I think, to realize that, and this goes back to the point about mindset, and then to convey it. And sometimes that requires, as is true in a sports team, and maybe you know this better, maybe that's true in a symphony orchestra as well, that we sort of dial each other up and just are making sure that mentally we're ready to deliver a top performance. Be it a presentation for a pitch, or be it an important presentation on the outcomes, whatever it is. The clients ought to be able to tell, boy, these people are really engaged in my success, and they're enjoying what they're doing. And that requires, sometimes boosting each other's enthusiasm level, as happens anywhere we look in be it music. One last anecdote on that: I saw a film about Madonna when she was in her early 20s, and it was amazing how she was pulling together the whole band and the dancers and so on, and really giving them a pep talk before they went on stage. And there's a quote from Mick Jagger that says, if you don't feel the nerves, the positive nerves and the excitement of going on stage, and then you're not going to be successful. And so prepare yourself mentally to deliver a top performance, and put yourself in a positive mindset. This is an opportunity, not a chance to fail.
Mm. Mark, thank you so much. That's been both really stimulating and inspiring for us. So
you're welcome, Mike, and good luck to you, huh?
Thank you so much, Mark.
Yep.
All the best.
Bye-bye. Yep, bye.